They say some places are cursed long before anyone sets foot there, that in certain corners of America, the land itself seems to whisper secrets, dark as the soil beneath it. But there is one town, a town that almost no one speaks of, where whispers of bloodlines twisted in ways most would call unnatural have echoed for generations. People who lived here passed down more than traditions. They passed down something unspoken, something heavy, something that clings to the marrow. They called it family, they called it heritage, but outsiders would call it horror. Imagine a place where everyone knows everyone else, not just by sight, but by blood, and where the very act of joining the world in marriage can sometimes be an act of repetition, an echo of what came before. This is not myth. This is history buried beneath the polite facades of small-town America. And today, we are going to peel back the layers of that darkness, layer by layer. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. To understand this town, you have to first understand isolation, not just geographic but social, psychological, spiritual. It is the kind of place that seems frozen, untouched by time, where the air feels thick with secrets and even the brightest days seem shadowed. Families intermarried not out of choice, but out of circumstance, out of the crushing weight of proximity. And with each generation, those choices compounded. Children were born with inherited peculiarities, not just in appearance, but in temperament, in instinct, in the way their minds processed the world. Outsiders would notice, and they would whisper. But the town endured, and it became a closed circuit, a looping history of human repetition that no historian could have predicted. And yet, despite this, people lived, laughed, and loved in ways that were ordinary on the surface. There were still birthdays and school dances, football games and church picnics. The horror was invisible, like a shadow cast across every celebration, unacknowledged yet undeniable. You could sit at a dinner table in this town and not see the grotesque patterns that linked its residents. But if you knew how to look, you could read it in the way neighbors spoke to each other, in the secrets tucked into letters, diaries, and oral stories passed quietly from parent to child. The history was written not in newspapers or textbooks, but in the blood of the living. And that is why few ever leave, because leaving is more than crossing state lines. Leaving is an attempt to sever a chain that has been forged over centuries. And even when people escape, the past follows. It follows in the way their children are born, in the way the town remembers them, and in the stories that eventually make their way to the surface for the rest of the world to see. This is the story of a place Americans have forgotten, yet it is written in the most intimate and terrifying way possible within the lines of their own family trees. This is not a story about monsters in the woods or shadows in abandoned buildings. This is a story about humans, about blood, about inheritance, about the parts of ourselves we pretend do not exist. And in this town, those parts were never hidden. They were nurtured, cultivated, and preserved, like a dark experiment conducted under the guise of ordinary life. And what you are about to see is what happens when that experiment lasts for centuries. The town's isolation was more than physical, it was psychological, cultural, and self-imposed. Generations of families had locked themselves in a way that outsiders would never truly understand. Roads led in, and in theory, they led out. But the culture, the expectations, and the weight of family legacy made leaving nearly impossible. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary rural settlement. White picket fences, small churches, a general store. But under that veneer of normality was a network of relationships so intertwined it defied logic. Cousins married cousins, uncles married distant nieces, and the resulting web of kinship grew denser with each passing decade. To some it was tradition, to others it was necessity. But in truth, it was the kind of pattern that slowly erodes individuality, replacing it with a shared, almost unnatural identity. And within this network, secrets were currency. Certain truths were never spoken aloud, but everyone knew them. Children learned early that some questions would never be answered. Marriages were arranged, sometimes without conscious malice, but with an understanding that bloodlines had to be maintained, that families had to remain intact. And when a new generation emerged, the patterns repeated themselves. Birth defects, psychological instability, unusual behaviors, these were catalogued quietly, almost clinically, by those who had lived through the town's history. Outsiders might have called it cursed, locals called it survival. The town story is not one of villains or monsters, but of humans pushed to the edge by circumstance, isolation, and their own traditions. Each family was a microcosm of the larger system, each home a repository of stories that no historian dared to write. Diaries, letters, and oral accounts, when pieced together, reveal a reality that is as fascinating as it is disturbing, a place where genetic repetition became the unspoken rule and where the consequences of that repetition were woven into daily life. Some children were born seemingly ordinary, others carried the weight of generations on their bodies and in their minds. And still, the town endured, because endurance was the only way anyone survived the truth of their heritage. Even outsiders who attempted to study or intervene were met with subtle resistance. They would notice the anomalies, the recurring traits, the strange familial overlaps, and they would write reports, publish papers, or send letters. But most of their work disappeared into archives, forgotten, ignored, or dismissed. It was as if the town itself conspired to remain unseen, to hide its story until someone brave, or foolish, enough would unearth it. And when that happened, the truth was rarely what the world expected. Because this town is not haunted by ghosts. It is haunted by the living, by the consequences of repeated patterns, by the way family history can shape a person's body, mind, and destiny. The darkness is subtle, creeping, almost invisible until it manifests in ways that are both undeniable and unforgettable. And to truly understand the horror here, one must look past headlines, past sensational stories, and into the quiet moments of daily life, where the weight of centuries presses down on ordinary people. The families in this town did not speak openly of their ancestry, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Photographs lined the walls of modest homes, showing faces that bore uncanny resemblances across generations. Eyes too similar, jawlines that mirrored one another, expressions that seemed inherited rather than learned. It was as if each child were a reflection of not just their parents, but of everyone who had come before them. Visitors sometimes remarked on it, sensing an almost invisible repetition, a rhythm to the town's population that defied natural randomness. And when the locals noticed those questions, they smiled politely, offered vague answers, and changed the subject. The truth, after all, was too fragile, too shameful, and too deeply rooted in their lives to be shared freely. School records tell part of the story. Attendance lists, yearbooks, and graduation photos reveal repeating surnames that can confuse even the most experienced genealogist. Teachers, some of whom were outsiders, noted unusual patterns in behavior, intelligence, and health. Some children were astonishingly brilliant in certain ways, yet profoundly limited in others. Medical anomalies appeared again and again, as though the town's isolation was incubating both genius and deformity simultaneously. And yet, despite these patterns, life went on. Children played in the streets, families attended church, and the rhythm of small-town life persisted. The horror lay not in visible chaos, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible ways bloodlines dictated destiny. Church records and civil documents paint an even darker picture. Marriages between close relatives were not always hidden, though they were often rationalized as preserving the family's honor or continuity. The town's leaders, both civic and religious, rarely intervened, perhaps understanding that interference could shatter the delicate social fabric. Over decades, this created a self-reinforcing loop. The more the town isolated itself, the more inbreeding occurred. The more inbreeding occurred, the more insular the community became. It was a cycle that no outsider could easily penetrate, a closed system of social and genetic repetition, humming quietly beneath the surface of what seemed like a perfectly normal town. Some historians who have dared to document the town's past describe it as a living laboratory of heredity, a place where human genetics and social behavior collided in unsettling ways. The stories of marriage, childbirth, and family rivalry are chronicled alongside tales of everyday life, but the pattern beneath them is unmistakable. It is a narrative written in repetition, in small deviations that become amplified over time. And in this narrative, every decision, every union, and every birth carries the weight of centuries. And yet, the townspeople rarely see themselves as cursed. To them, it is simply life. It is family. It is survival. But for anyone who steps back and observes with a historian's eye, or with a visitor's curiosity, the weight of history here is crushing, almost unbearable. Every handshake, every greeting, every introduction carries with it a story that is impossible to escape. The town may appear ordinary, but beneath its surface lies a history that is intimate, relentless, and profoundly disturbing. To truly grasp the gravity of this town, one must understand the consequences of generations of repeated bloodlines. The impact is not always visible at first glance, but it exists in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Children born into this environment often carry inherited physical traits that mark them as part of a lineage few outsiders could ever untangle. Eyes, ears, the shape of a hand or a jawline. These are clues, hints of a family tree that loops back on itself like a snake eating its own tail. But it is not just physical. There are patterns of temperament, of behavior, of instinct that seem hardwired into those who live here. Some are unusually withdrawn, others intensely fixated, some disturbingly clever, some frighteningly narv. Medical records, when they can be accessed, reveal a history that outsiders would find chilling. Conditions that are rare elsewhere appear with alarming frequency. Genetic disorders, mental illness, unusual susceptibility to disease, all of it traces back through the same familial lines, sometimes for decades, and yet the town persists. Doctors come and go, researchers arrive to study the patterns, but the fabric of the community is resilient. It is as if the town itself is a vessel for a history too fragile and too horrifying to be disrupted. And in this resilience lies a dark irony. What keeps the town alive also perpetuates the very patterns that make it infamous. There are stories whispered among those who dare speak of them that illustrate the psychological weight carried by this place. Children growing up knowing their cousins are also their siblings, neighbors are also extended family, and friends are also future in-laws. It creates a reality where normal social boundaries are blurred beyond recognition. Friendships carry the weight of unspoken kinship. School rivalries can resemble family feuds, and romantic attraction is complicated by the intimate, unavoidable connections forged by generations of insular living. Outsiders often call it unnatural, but for those born into it, it is simply life. The invisible lines that define morality, affection, and identity are warped in ways that outsiders can scarcely imagine. And yet, beneath all of this, life goes on in its ordinary rhythms. Children still laugh, families still argue, couples still marry, and communities still gather to celebrate and mourn together. It is a town of contradictions, beauty and horror intertwined so completely that separating one from the other feels impossible. The darkness is quiet, almost imperceptible, yet it shapes every decision, every relationship, every story. Generations of choices, repeated endlessly, have created a reality that is both tragic and inevitable. This is what makes the town haunting. It is not a place of sudden shocks or overt violence. The horror is slow, cumulative, written in the bones of its people, in their eyes, in the very way they move through the world. To study it, to witness it, is to confront something ancient and inescapable. And for anyone who dares to look, the question is not just, what happened here? But, how does one escape when the past is literally in your blood? By the time outsiders begin to understand the patterns in this town, they are already drawn into its gravity. You see, the repetition is not only genetic, it is cultural. Stories, beliefs, and behaviors are passed down with the same inevitability as eye color or a crooked smile. Children are taught who they can marry, who they should avoid, and which family names carry the weight of history. And even when someone rebels, even when they attempt to leave, the ties that bind are often stronger than geography, stronger than desire. Letters return unopened, friends fade away, memories cling, blood remembers what the mind might try to forget. Visitors often report an uncanny sensation upon entering the town, a subtle unease that grows stronger over time. The streets feel familiar and alien simultaneously. Faces blur together. Patterns repeat in ways that are almost hypnotic. Some describe it as stepping into a dream where the dreamer already knows the ending, but refuses to reveal it. And for those who dig too deep, the truth can be dangerous. Not legally, not physically, but psychologically. The weight of witnessing generations of inbreeding, secrecy, and repeated mistakes can be crushing. It is as if the town itself is a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human inheritance. Yet the people who live here often feel no shame. To them, these patterns are tradition, continuity, a form of belonging that outsiders cannot comprehend. There is comfort in repetition, in knowing the faces around you, in having the past guide every step of your future. But the cost is high. Families carry not only shared histories but shared vulnerabilities. Mental illness, chronic disease, and subtle deformities ripple quietly through generations, often concealed under polite smiles and social rituals. The longer the cycle continues, the more entangled it becomes, until the distinction between choice and fate is nearly impossible to discern. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because in this town, that question is not hypothetical, it is reality. Every resident faces it in some form, often multiple times, as the cycle repeats and the choices narrow. It is a slow, relentless pressure that shapes everything: marriages, friendships, careers, even the way people perceive themselves. The town is a crucible of inherited consequence, and no one escapes untouched. And yet life continues. Children grow, learn, and eventually take their place within the web of relationships. Love still exists here, though it is complicated, often inseparable from duty and history. Birthdays are celebrated. Deaths are mourned. The town endures because it is built on repetition, on expectation, on the acceptance of what outsiders would call unthinkable. It is ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, and the horror lies in its normality. To look away is easy, to understand is almost unbearable. The psychological weight of living in this town is invisible but relentless. Children grow up learning lessons that outsiders cannot see. Which behaviors are acceptable, which unions are encouraged, which secrets must never be spoken aloud. And as the years pass, those lessons manifest in ways both subtle and profound. Some residents develop coping mechanisms that appear normal, almost adaptive, but beneath the surface lies an undercurrent of tension, anxiety, and inherited trauma. It is a town where the past is not just history, it is an active force, shaping the minds, bodies, and hearts of everyone who lives there. Medical professionals who have studied the area speak of unusual patterns that defy conventional explanation. Certain diseases appear at higher rates, mental health challenges manifest in predictable ways, and peculiar physical traits recur generation after generation. Geneticists might call it inbreeding, anthropologists might describe it as cultural preservation. But the effect is the same: a community bound together by repetition, unable to escape the consequences of choices made long before they were born. Even the most well-intentioned outsider, armed with science and logic, struggles to comprehend the full scope of what has unfolded here. Socially, the town functions like a living organism. Each family is a cell in a complex system, and every action, every marriage, every birth, every move is influenced by centuries of accumulated history. Boundaries are blurred. The line between friend and relative, ally and rival, love and obligation is almost impossible to discern. Outsiders are aware of the strange dynamics immediately, but for residents it is simply life. And life here, in all its ordinary rituals, carries with it the weight of extraordinary repetition. That is the hidden horror of this town, that normalcy and abnormality exist side by side, inseparable, indistinguishable to anyone who has not grown up inside it. And yet, despite the challenges, the town endures. Families survive, adapt, and find meaning within their insular world. Births still bring joy, marriages still carry hope, funerals still evoke grief. The community persists because it is intertwined in ways that are both genetic and emotional, creating resilience in the face of a reality that outsiders might call a curse. Every generation inherits not just DNA, but a set of unspoken rules, expectations, and legacies that guide their lives, often without conscious awareness. In the end, this is a story not of villainy, but of inevitability. It is a tale of humans caught in cycles they cannot fully control, of generations shaped by both circumstance and choice, and of the quiet, persistent power of history written in blood. The town exists as a reminder that sometimes the darkest truths are not found in legends or haunted houses. They are found in the ordinary lives of ordinary people, living out extraordinary legacies that the rest of the world was never meant to witness. And so, the story of this town comes full circle, not with a climactic moment of terror, but with the slow, unavoidable realization that what is extraordinary here is entirely human. There are no monsters hiding in the woods, no supernatural forces at play, only people living within the confines of history, culture, and blood. Their lives are shaped by choices that predate them, by patterns that have repeated for centuries, and by a reality that is both ordinary and profoundly unsettling. What makes this town unforgettable is not the shocking moments you might expect, but the quiet, cumulative horror of seeing generations repeat themselves without escape. Every handshake, Every smile, every greeting is layered with history. The repetition is inescapable, insidious, and ever-present. It is the legacy of survival, adaptation, and inevitability, woven into the fabric of the town like a dark tapestry that outsiders are not meant to touch. And yet, the human mind is drawn to what is hidden. We want to know, to understand, to peer behind the veil. That is why stories like this persist, whispered in archives, letters, and conversations, waiting for someone to uncover the truth and recognize the weight of what has come before. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is the duality of existence here. Life continues as normal, filled with love, laughter, and community, yet beneath that surface lies the inescapable imprint of history and heredity. Births are both celebrations and reminders, marriages are both unions and repetitions, daily life is both mundane and loaded with invisible consequence. It is a place where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, where the familiar becomes unsettling, and where every resident carries a story written in the most intimate and unalterable way, their bloodline. As historians, as outsiders, or simply as curious witnesses, we are left to grapple with the reality that this town is neither evil nor tragic. It simply is. It exists as a testament to what happens when isolation, tradition, and human nature collide over generations. And in that collision, a unique form of horror emerges. Not the kind of horror that shocks in an instant, but the kind that settles deep into your understanding of what it means to inherit not just a name, but a destiny. So, as you reflect on this story, consider the quiet power of history, the invisible weight of ancestry, and the ways in which repetition can shape entire communities. This town remains, hidden in plain sight, a chilling reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that sometimes the darkest truths of humanity are written not in legends, but in the ordinary lives of ordinary people.